The next speaker is Giulia, that's me, but the paper I'm presenting is actually co-authored with Des Gasper, who is sitting here in the third row. Thanks.
It's coming.
Okay. So it's the result of, what we're basically trying to do here is to think about a whole body of work that we've partly been involved in jointly, partly we have not been involved in at all. But at the ISS, where Des has been based for a long time and I spent 5 years, we have been, there's a cluster of people working on international migration that has been trying to apply the human security framework to transnational migration. I quite recently moved to the Free University of Amsterdam to an anthropology department that for quite a few number of years was trying to develop an anthropological approach to human security. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to draw on that body of work and work and on the basis of basically literature review as well as research insight from the work of these two institutes and think a little bit more about the connections between transnationalism and human security. So this is very much work in progress. It needs a lot of sharpening and refinement. So, well, my main message to you is please be kind and generous in the Q&A and give us lots of useful tips so that we can make this better. So the paper is based on a critical review of a very small part of the migration literature, which is that concerned with the relation between integration and transnationalism. And we have a simple argument. We believe that this literature suffers from what we could call a receiving country bias. It reflects widespread policy and public opinion concerns that are typical of culturally diverse, mainly Western societies, about people's political loyalties and democratic values. It suffers from methodological nationalism because in the framing of research questions and in the definition of its analytical concept, this work is largely aligned with nation-building efforts of states. And what we suggest is that human security analysis can bring this research at another level, focusing on how identities and differences are socially constructed as security concerns. So how integration and transnationalism are understood rather than how they are related to one another. And this links to our main reading of the literature because what we find in reading work that has been concerned with the relation with integration and transnationalism is that initially scholars were asking themselves, that they were concerned with the nature of the relation between the two, and this literature usually presented itself as a critique to the common sense assumption that the two generate a zero-sum game, so that less integration equals more transnational ties, and vice versa, that better integration equals less transnational ties. And an overview of this literature shows that it failed to reach unanimous conclusions, partly because it is focusing sometimes on in-depth studies on single ethnic communities, so that makes it very difficult to generalize. But there are quite a number of survey-based comparative studies that point at different findings. So some are making the argument that strong transnational ties go hand in hand with good integration, for instance, among entrepreneur migrants, migrants who are politically engaged across borders. But then transnational ties can also be cultivated as a reaction to bad integration in other cases. At the same time, migrants who are poorly integrated can also have loose transnational ties. So we really can't nail one answer to that question. So what have scholars done? They've moved to changing the question. So the literature is now acknowledging that integration and transnationalism can actually go hand in hand in various ways, and it's tried to explore the various possible combinations of the two and understand what circumstances generate those different combinations. We want to take a step forward from this literature, and we question it not so much because of its results, but because of the way in itself in which it frames the actual research questions and core concepts. And our argument is that understandings of integration and transnationalism are based on an underlying conception of these terms as opposites that are rooted in potentially competing loyalties, and this is what we disagree on. Because as a result, research on integration and transnationalism ends up reflecting majority thinking, in which integration largely corresponds to the adaptation to the norms and values of host societies, with the onus to adapt placed on the migrants. And transnationalism, well, there's quite a lot of analytical slippage here between transnational and ethnic communities, so that transnationalism becomes the maintenance of distinctive and ethnic cultural traits. And also the idea that transnationalism corresponds to a very homogeneous set of belongings and actions, and that it is a friction-free state of being. And both these statements have actually been contrasted by a lot of literature on transnationalism. So because of this framing in a lot of the literature of integration and transnationalism as opposites, we argue that this literature does suffer from methodological nationalism. And according to Nina Glick-Schiller, by focusing on long-term integration as something that is needed or occurring, mainstream migration scholars accept national borders as the borders of society and as the necessary institutional nexus for citizenship, democratic rights, or social welfare. And this has allowed research on integration to focus on differences between minority and majority groups within the nation. But ironically, transnationalism originally, at least in our interpretation of it, originally emerged as an alternative paradigm within migration studies to actually challenge the methodological nationalism of mainstream research by allowing a theorization of simultaneity and of the ways in which people incorporate in their daily lives activities, routines, and institutions that are both local and transnationalism. So Nina Glick-Schiller herself, however, recognized that in research practice, transnationalism has been inadequately incorporated into migration scholarship, so that even transnational scholars have ended up falling into the trap of methodological nationalism. So our argument is that research on transnationalism and integration would do better to focus on how these concepts are actually constructed. Integration is understood in relative terms, and of particular differences between majority and minority populations, some of which are seen as acceptable, some are not. And in this I am referring to the work of Marta Bivand-Erdal and Kerry Oppen, who have already started pushing forward these kind of arguments. So whether transnational ties are seen as a challenge to integration or not depends on underlying understandings of nation, ethnicity, and difference. For instance, research on, sorry, I've got my slides. My slides have gone. Okay. For instance, there is research on migrants in the Netherlands by Snell and colleagues concludes that immigrant groups who are perceived to be culturally different from mainstream society and with lower levels of integration face greater challenges in combining transnational ties and cultural integration. So they engage in forms of what's been defined resistance transnationalism in face of harsh integration. And what we argue is that questions like this could be rephrased. Instead of investigating under what conditions transnational ties do or do not pose a threat to integration, we could ask to what extent cultural difference is actually acceptable or not. So rather than looking at the mutual relationship of integration and transnationalism, our argument is that research should look critically into how they are constructed as social and analytical categories. And our argument is that a human security approach can do this by focusing on the way in which different actors understand integration and transnationalism as the outcome of a mutual bargaining process of both material and emotional security. And we think that a human security perspective builds on the work of scholars of transnationalism and allows a more adequate grasp of the nature and possibilities for integration in an era of globalization. So an approach that looks at integration and transnationalism as socially constructed phenomena also reflects a broader development in immigration research, which increasingly challenge the assumption that dividing society into different ethnic groups is both analytically and empirically meaningful. And I'm thinking here of work of people like Bauman, his critique of essentialized notions of culture in community study, Vertovik's work on superdiversity, etc. Now, there are some examples of the kind of research that we're trying to outline here that come in this book, A World of Insecurity, which is one of the productions of the Free University of Amsterdam, investigating the relationship between anthropology and human security. And in this book, Thomas Eriksson and colleagues argue for the use of an anthropological and ethnographic perspective to understand human security as it is experienced, understood, and lived by different actors. And a number of chapters present migration-related case studies that explore human security in the experiences not only of migrants, but also of natives, and sometimes both, in Western societies. And many of the examples contained in this book that are migration-related, because not all the chapters are drawn from the case of Amsterdam. So what is it that makes human security, in our argument, a good approach? It takes security, human security takes worldwide interconnections as foundational. So what it does, it adopts a global framework. And this allows it to overcome the limitations of methodologically nationalist research that explains and allocates responsibility for events inside a country only in terms of factors and agents within those borders. So the challenge here is to analyze integration and transnationalism as processes that interact with one another within the geographical space of the host society, but also acknowledging that people are embedded in multiple social and territorial frameworks, as transnationalism has already shown. And a human security perspective increases attention to the risks and pressures to which people are subject within global systems of interconnection, and to security, how it is experienced at different scales that link the personal, the local, the national, and the transnational. The second strength of human security analysis is that it takes a person-centered rather than a state-centered perspective. And as part of this, it recognizes people as members of multiple communities where they seek systems of identity and affiliation. So using how people experience and live migration as a point of departure allows a deeper understanding of migration systems and how they evolve that goes beyond generalized explanations about when people move, the economic impacts, etc., that often dominate migration research. And again, human security analysis combines the global framework and the person-centered rather than state-centered perspective together. And this makes them mutually reinforcing because they are joined up in our thinking. So the transnational approach to migration studies that was presented in the 1990s as an alternative paradigm that put concerns for social justice at the center, rather than only nation-building or nation-maintaining projects of states. But unfortunately, as we have argued, most of the research on integration and transnationalism has actually lost this critical angle, and we believe that human security can actually bring this back in. Transnationalism also emerged in a particular historical juncture in which the world was coming to terms with globalization. It was a time of economic boom, optimism, porous borders, and everybody was happy to look at this with positive eyes. Whereas in the current historical conjuncture, as we well know, and the European migration crisis is a very striking example of this, a paradigm inspired by human security perspectives may actually do fuller justice, we think, to contemporary reality in the face of new nationalism and migration being linked to new forms of precariness. Examples of how this research might look through empirical cases are contained in this book that was one of an output of the group working on migration and human security at ISS. And I just want to briefly, I'm going to go slightly over time here, but I just want to briefly illustrate one example. In one of the chapters, Don van Naarsen looks at two Dutch-speaking groups in the Netherlands, the Moluccans and the mixed race Indish Dutch. So both originate from Indonesia, and they have very, very different trajectories of integration in the Netherlands. And he finds that in both groups, ties to Indonesia do not decline, and transnational community organization, in fact, increases over time. But the differences in integration paths, he suggests, may be better understood when they are related to the white Dutch host society's majority persistence use of the official concept of allochtoon, which literally means from another soil, to describe people, to describe ethnic minorities, which keeps the groups conceptually separated from and by white Dutch society. So to conclude, a human security understanding interrogates a prevalent focus on integration as migrants' capacity to adapt and fit into existing societal structures. It interrogates the interpretation of those very structures by policymakers, us as academics, migrants and non-migrants. It enters into the life worlds, constraints, opportunities and subjectivities of all participants and considers how those are interlinked. So, because it considers both integration and transnationalism as the outcomes of a mutual bargaining process of material and emotional security, in which different actors give different meanings to both terms. And this also brings back into migration research a focus on power imbalances between different actors that is very often absent in research on integration and transnationalism.